Welcome to this Q&A on the Tribune's reporting on the Panguitch boarding school. Before we get started, I want to thank everybody who's joining us for making a donation, and I wanted to announce that all the money raised from this event is going to be given to the Paiute tribe. Last week, the Tribune published an article by Courtney Tanner and Alastair Bitsóí about a school that operated in Panguitch from 1904 to 1909. As our reporting showed, children were forced to go there, Indigenous children, mostly from the Paiute tribe. And our article also reported that historians and tribal leaders believe that many of those children never left and are buried on the grounds of the school, which is now farmland. So today we're lucky to have the two authors of the piece with us, along with two experts, Professor Dena from the University of Utah and Professor Roni Draper from BYU. I'm just going to take a moment and let the panelists introduce themselves, starting with Alastair. Alastair.
Thank you, Grant. My name is Alastair Bitsóí. I'm Dena, but also the Southern Utah reporter for the Salt Lake Tribune. I've been on the team for a little over a month, and I'm originally from Nochtuni Navajo Nation, New Mexico.
And Professor Dena, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Chokma, my name is Dena, and I'm a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma, as well as a citizen of the United States. Professionally, I have been a social worker, specializing in social welfare, social justice policies around American Indian, Alaska Native, and Indigenous peoples of North America. And I am by no means an expert. Everything I share today is from my my scholarly research, if you will, my interest and my passion for bringing justice and peace to Native and Indigenous communities. And also to set my intent that I also want to acknowledge that the work that I do and my ability to be here today is because I'm on the traditional ancestral homelands of the Shoshone, the Paiute, the Goshute, and the Ute tribes. And thanks for their descendants and their ancestors that allow me to be able to be here with you today. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Courtney, would you like to go next?
Yeah, hi there. I'm Courtney Tanner. I am a reporter at the Salt Lake Tribune. I've been here for a little more than 5 years, and I focus mostly on education.
All right, and finally, Roni Draper, Professor Roni Draper.
Ayakwi, Nekna Roni Draper. I am a enrolled member of the Yurok tribe. I'm also a U.S. citizen, and I am from the village of Wispus or Witchpeck, which is at the mouth or the fork of the Trinity and Klamath Rivers, which is in what is now called California. I am an educator, a teacher educator here at BYU, and I work with folks who are becoming teachers and talk with them about multicultural issues, including discussions about race and decolonizing education.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. So for the people tuning in, this is a question and answer, and we are hoping to get questions from you and get to everybody's questions. So please put them in the chat and we will pass them around to our panelists. We're hoping to keep our answers short so we can get to as many questions as we can. Why don't we start at the top? Alastair, I'm hoping you can tell us about where this story came from.
Yes, thank you, Grant, and thank you all. Nice to be here again. How I was engaged with this story or asked to be in this story to tell the narrative of boarding schools, specifically the Panguitch boarding school in Southern Utah, was due in part through conversations internally with the team. I'd like to acknowledge Jessica Miller for pointing us in the direction we needed to go, and then just having basically being assigned by Grant to go out to Cedar City in July to cover the flooding that was happening in that portion of the state where there was like large amounts of flooding. And so that was my debut to the Salt Lake Tribune. And then that's just being in Cedar City and Enoch, I realized like there's other stakeholders or people connected to the flooding that was happening, and I immediately thought like, oh wow, this is like Paiute land. I mean, that's what I thought when I was in the area. And I reached out to Chairwoman Karina Bo, who is the chairwoman now of the Paiute Indian Tribe of Utah. And that's where I kind of started to forge this relationship with her, as far as like not knowing that I would be talking to her 3 weeks later with this story that Courtney Tanner and I broke last week in regarding Panguitch boarding school. And so that's kind of how I got involved with this story, and then just the guidance of the managing editors like Grant and like the rest of the team that was involved. And Leah took photos for this story as well. So that's how I got started with this story.
So Professor Ned, I think for kind of the newsroom hunch started with the follow to what's happening in Canada, where they're having their own reckoning over Indigenous schools. And as of now, they've found over 1,000 bodies on various campuses in Canada. I think probably many Utahns were surprised that we have a similar issue in our state. And I'm wondering, given your background, what was your reaction when you read the article?
Well, two things. One, sadness, because after the reveal earlier this summer, probably around the time that Alastair was going down to the Cedar City area, with the discovery of the unmarked graves of the missing but never forgotten, I need to add, relations from, that were at former residential schools in Canada, it occurred to me it's just a matter of time before then all of the places here in the United States that had federally, supported or church supported boarding schools, it was going to happen here. So there was that sadness, but then it was also like, okay, here's the first one, right? And the other piece that that I experienced was I didn't know Panguitch had a boarding school. In terms of its history, 5 years from what I understand from the article that it was in operation. And why did it close down? Because of all the children who were dying. Right? And now to know and understand that those children were never able to go home, or their families never knew and could never properly grieve, those were my initial reactions to the article.
Yeah. Courtney, you did the bulk of the historical research. I'm wondering if you can talk about what your sources were. Where did you start? It seems like you were able to pull in a lot of different documentation from a lot of different sources. But ultimately they were kind of one-sided. They were from the people who ran the school.
Yeah, and that's a really good point when we're talking about the history of the school, and it is, a lesser known school. All of the documentation is from a white perspective, and so I think that's really important to keep in mind when we're looking at these historical documents. So yeah, I kind of started actually with a piece that a doctoral student had done, and so we found this piece that they had written about the Panguitch school. And then we started looking through their citations, finding books based on that. I also ran through the Utah newspaper digital archives, doing different search terms. Some resulted in like 1,000 responses, but weren't all related, obviously, to the Panguitch school. I also found a lot of firsthand reports from the superintendents of the schools, from Department of Interior reports, which are trickier to find than I thought they would be. So you can find them on Google Books, but they don't list the year. So I ended up clicking through like probably 50 DOI reports trying to find the correct years that lined up with the school. And yeah, that's, I think where we kind of found our biggest break in this was, I think a 1904, 1905, from the earliest years of the school, report from the DOI where the superintendent and a field matron there mentioned that a student had died, had gone sick, and was buried there.
And I know that Stephen Lee, who is the historic preservation officer for Panguitch, was also, he's been researching this for a long time and was a critical part of the research.
Could I add there about Stephen? Because I feel like I do want to acknowledge him as a historic preservation officer to this story, because he had already done the research That was, of course, I guess coincidentally happening when we were going to write this story. And I want to acknowledge him because he has done a lot of goodness for this, like to tell the truth in that role that he's in, and it's a volunteer role. But also he was critical because he could have said no to us, to the Tribune, not to tell the story, because he was writing pieces, snippets of it on his social media, but also he was going to share it with the local newspaper in Panguitch or whatever outlet was there. And so like me, being assigned to this portion of the story, I basically I talked with them about like, are you okay? Like, we can tell it too. Like, are you okay? Maybe delaying your piece for the larger audience that would receive this, but not, I think it's clear to clarify that the goal wasn't for us just to break the story and like, oh, the Tribune did this, but it was more like, okay, we have a larger audience and we can help bring some sort of justice to the communities, the Paiute communities impacted by this whole truth.
Yeah. Professor Draper, there's one date in the article which stuck out to me, and that was that Walter Runke, who ran the school and would actually go on to be an Arizona state senator, died in 1964, which makes the whole thing feel very present. This is not ancient history. I'm wondering, how present is the trauma of these schools inside of Indigenous communities, even in the year 2021?
Sure. I mean, my grandma survived boarding schools. My aunties, I don't know very many Indigenous people who don't know somebody personally who is a survivor or maybe even a lost child to boarding schools. And so this is something that is in the memories of present day people. It's not something that is in, ancient history. There are people who are walking on the earth right now who are themselves survivors of boarding schools. They remember it in their own bodies. And so this isn't ancient days. This feels very present, and it feels very right now. These are the stories I grew up with, not from my family, obviously not from something I learned in school. So yeah, this is very present.
And can I just ask, as part of that, are there stories of children who went away to school and never came back? Is that a big part of the stories which get told in these communities?
Sure. I don't know that there is. I mean, as the stories started coming out from Canada and the schools there, I just thought, of course, like every school in the United States is going to have the same deal. They're Indigenous peoples have already been telling us that their children didn't return. And what has happened is we just simply haven't maybe believed them. And we haven't reckoned with those oral accounts. I mean, what Courtney talks about is maybe we have these accounts from historical records, the way that that white folks have kept records, but we haven't really taken seriously the way that Indigenous people have told their stories and kept their records. And those records have indicated that children did not come home. And so the only conclusion that can be drawn is that those children and their remains are still at the schools.
Courtney, this is a big story in terms of all the different places it can go. I'm wondering what you're looking at next in terms of taking this story to the next step.
Right. And yeah, Alastair and I are not going to stop here. We definitely want to keep working on this story and telling stories on this. And we've been trying also to put tribal perspectives kind of at the forefront of this, because these are the perspectives that haven't been heard on this, unfortunately. So kind of, I think the next steps are to map out where all of the Indigenous schools were in Utah. Brigham City was kind of the biggest, most well-known one. But as we saw with Panguitch, I mean, we had this little school that wasn't very well known, and there were, loss of life there. It's very horrific. There were 2 schools on Ute tribal land. I mean, we want to go into and dig further into all of these locations and tell the stories that haven't been told.
On that note, Professor Ned, I know that there were several other schools in Utah. In terms of the details from the Panguitch story, the disease, the deaths, do you think there are more Panguitch-like schools in Utah?
I want to believe that there are not, but I think this goes back to Professor Draper and this message of we haven't listened to tribal communities tell of these abuses and atrocities, and honestly, genocide that has occurred as recent as the 20th century. And knowing that we have 8 federally recognized tribal nations here in the state of Utah, and we know that there were boarding schools, as was mentioned in Brigham City, the name Intermountain Indian School. We know there was a school in Aneth. We know there was a school in Uinta and a school in Ouray. Now we know of the remains, like literally, of the Panguitch school. So I can't even guess if there are, where they're at. Right? Because look at this story in particular, how it was known to the community, known to the tribe, that there were descendants and survivors of that time who passed on their stories, right? And that's one of the tribes. So it's a question to ask the native peoples of Utah, if there were.
And I just want to remind everyone watching that we're more than welcome to take your questions. So please type them into the box there. Alastair, I know, like most Indigenous people, you've had family members who attended these schools. As a family, do you feel like that's something you carried?
Yeah, so I know I went to a community school here when I grew up. So it was a former boarding school in New Mexico, but also I do have relatives and like a generation before my 2 generations, a grandparent who actually was, I was sharing this with the team, like she was homecoming queen at Intermountain. So that was kind of, I guess, I don't know, a cool story there. But yeah, I was talking to Dena off background and she can understand. And I'm pretty sure that Roni can as well, but I realized, like, especially the trauma associated with it, I feel like it's still within us now, within us as people living. I know when I was growing up as a child, like the discipline that my parents like thought was healthy discipline, actually, when you think about it, stems from boarding school treatment. And so like those abuses are still rampant in our communities, sadly. And so like it takes maybe some of us, not all of us, but like all of us to heal that portion of us as humans. And I know the discipline I got wasn't healthy. And so like I had to reconcile that personally to get to where I'm at now, telling this story about the Panguitch boarding school and those connections that need to be healed there. And I think when you ask Courtney the next phase of the story, I feel like the next phase also is like we have to wait for the the Paiute tribes, the bands, to respond to us, and we can't pressure them. That's what I think. And I think that's the dilemma I face, as like, I'm Native first and then I'm a journalist second. And so like I have to navigate those internal compasses, but also I have to navigate the compass of the tribes and those and those media, I guess, unofficial tribal cultural protocols that exist in each of our communities, because they're all different. And so with the Paiutes, I guess if we want to work with them, we have to have them lead, at least with the Panguitch story. I feel like if there's the Aneth story, that the boarding school in Aneth, which is southern Utah, or the northern portion of the Navajo Nation, that would take diligence there as well, and as well as in the Paiute boarding schools.
So, Professor Draper, one of the things that Alastair said to me when we started this story was he was almost surprised that this was news, because it was such common knowledge for him and his community. I'm wondering, inside of Indigenous communities, how much does this get talked about? How much is this news? Does this story surprise anyone?
I can't imagine inside Indigenous communities that this would be surprising. I think this is, talking about Indigenous boarding schools, talking about forced adoption, talking about other means of genocide that has been perpetrated against Indigenous communities, is just sort of common conversation. It's just like part of the ethos. And when I talk about it in my classes for folks who are becoming teachers, they almost always are learning about it for the first time. They're shocked about the knowledge of Indian boarding schools, or sometimes they might have heard about Carlisle Indian boarding school. It's like one of the largest and most famous, like longest running schools in the US. But they don't think that it happened in Utah, or they don't think it happened in Nevada, or they don't think it happened, in the West or whatever. And so I think those are the things that are, are surprising for me to have to. I have to remind myself that other people don't know these things. This is not part of their common understanding and part of their common upbringing. These aren't the stories told at their dinner tables or around their campfires.
So Courtney, if we could talk shop for a little bit, we edited the heck out of that article. I'm wondering, were there any bits which didn't get in, which you were disappointed, or what were the historical pieces which we had to cut for space, which you thought were worth mentioning?
That's a good question. As a reporter, cuts are hard for me. We're always kind of married to what we write. I mean, there's always more background that we didn't get in. One thing I was happy that we did get in was the story of Walter Runke. He was the second superintendent at the school, and went on to have this kind of infamous, I guess is maybe the best word I can think of, legacy himself, where he was indicted for killing a Navajo man when he moved on to another school. And that whole legacy there, I mean, I think it just speaks to really the pain and the treatment of students, and kind of the forced way that they were sent to these schools. So there's more of that, sadly. Just a lot of not kind comments in some of these, like, Department of Interior reports that we looked through. Just obviously rude ways of speaking about Indigenous people and these students, undermining them, being condescending about their education. I think that all just paints a picture of really the treatment at these schools.
And if I could add something to this conversation right now, that for those who are with us today and are interested in knowing more about the importance of this story, is understanding that boarding schools were just one piece of the US government's federal Indian policies that even predated the United States. And so boarding schools or residential schools in Canada were just one more piece of a prolonged attack of the growth of the United States and the expansion and the need for resources and the need for the creation of the US government. Boarding schools were created as because killing Indians became out of fashion. It's as simple as that. It started with, in terms of policy, there were treaties and there were wars, all predating the US. The indigenous peoples of what is now the United States were considered sovereign nations. There were treaties created with tribes from France, from England, I want to say from Spain as well. And then we have the creation of the United States in the 1700s, and then it became the Removal Act. And for my family, who were part of what is known as the 5 civilized tribes, Chickasaw and Choctaw, we were physically relocated, removed from the southeastern part of the United States and relocated to Oklahoma, which no one knew what existed in what is now today Oklahoma. No one in the United States knew what was west of the Mississippi, right? You're all probably familiar with the Lewis and Clark stories. But the reason why these stories about what happened to boarding school and who is missing and who never came home, why tribes and tribal communities still talk about this is because we don't forget. And we can't forget because it's not in the books that are taught in our K through 12 system. So yeah, I know about Lewis and Clark, and maybe I know about their Indian guide who had her child on her back. It isn't that great, but we never heard about why that happened or how that was fortunate, right? So you went for removal, that didn't work. Then it went to allotments where the US government parceled out the land where they had moved everyone west of the Mississippi. And then it was about assimilation and civilization. So now you have the infamous Carlisle boarding school in 67 or 76 to kill the Indian and save the man. You can't kill the Indian anymore, but we're going to save them. We're going to civilize. We're going to assimilate because we need where they are at. And then that didn't work. And then the 20th century came and the reservation periods came and treaties came, and then termination of those treaty rights, termination of identity as a tribal nation or entity by the US government to say, you don't exist. You are all US citizens like everyone else. So you can survive, you can thrive like everyone else here in the land of opportunity. And then they were terminated, they were relocated to urban areas, removed from their ancestral lands. And now we were in a policy era of self-determination. And who knows what that means, because we have over 570 federally recognized American Indian tribes here in the United States, which means these are sovereign countries, or excuse me, sovereign nations that have relationships with the federal government. Yet that representation of this history, again, Panguitch, who knew, right?
Yeah.
We never read about it. So I just want to kind of add that context to that Native peoples, it's these stories, a lot of this is intergenerational trauma or historical trauma that, yes, we continue to talk about it, but there are layers that have happened. And as human beings, we all experience trauma. You know, as much as that, some people think that's just a trendy term to say someone's having a bad day. Mm-hmm. No, we're humans. We experience trauma, but a situation like boarding schools that were specifically created to pull apart families, because how do you have somebody by the throat more than when you take their child away and you never know if you're going to see them again?
Yeah.
That's trauma. And then to have all these years now, 25, 50, 100, I'm a social worker, I'm not a mathematician. So I think, you know, over 100 years, right?
Yeah.
of not knowing where your family went, or not being able to have that opportunity to grieve or to bury your loved ones and send them off with love and respect to where they go to next. They never had that. That's all.
Alastair, I know as storytellers, we had a lot of different ways to tell this story. And I think we deliberately tried to center the Paiute experience in this. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what that was like from a reporting point of view.
Yeah, that was, I want to credit Courtney for navigating the historical record. I don't know how she did that. I was just like, wow, I don't know how to start this. But then when I saw their first copy of the story, and I was like, okay, this is where I need to fill in the gaps to talk to the sources, because I did talk to the sources directly for this story. And that included Stephen Lee, Karina Bowe, chairwoman, and then Tamara Borshort Slayton, who I knew previously in different work in Utah. And so like, I was like, okay, these are the sources for this story that need to be told. And so like, just starting with Karina, it took a while to get her on record, just because she had issue with another media outlet and their coverage of a story there. And so like, I had to assure her, like, you can trust me. I'm Dena. I'm a Native reporter, and I feel like I have your interest in this story, not to exploit it. And there was conversations about that, like, how do you navigate that? And I feel like this story, knowing or unknowingly know that of the graves that are there that need to be verified, like, it was just kind of like, I had to process that as a human, as a person. And I feel like it spiritually hurt me in some ways as well. Like, I had to like navigate that from a spiritual standpoint first. And then I had to like consider, I was like, okay, but this is heavy. And like, it literally took me out. Like, I had to recover from it. Like, I think I did get nauseous from it. Like, I had to undergo that personally. And then I was like, okay, Alastair, you got to get back up. Like, you have to tell this story in the most culturally appropriate way. And I feel like the way the interviews happen, they happen naturally, but it had to take a while. I had to work a lot with the chairwoman, who I respect, because she is new to her role as a new leader for her people. And so like, I just kind of started with her, then it led to Stephen Lee, where we had extensive conversation. And then the conversation with Tamara, and I just felt like they're the real storytellers to this story. And so that's also where I wanted credit. And so like, that's kind of where, just looking at what Courtney had found, I just like, okay, this is where you fill in the gaps with their story. And so that's kind of what we did. And there was extensive editing and just like little background that I know about the story helped move it. And I feel like other outlets like Indian Country Today, for instance, likes the story. And we've, as a journalistic piece, I guess, as a body of work, we've been given credit as good reporting. And so like, I'm happy to work with this story on that. And I'm just really pleased with how it came out. I feel like there's the question, Courtney, you can correct me, but I felt like we would need to probably explore the maybe the role of the church, because I know that was a question that we've gotten as well. And so I know first the Presbyterians were the ones who first were brought into the area. And so, yeah.
Yeah, and I can jump in on that. Yeah, a piece of future reporting that we want to do, Alastair and I, specifically, is looking at the Mormon Indian Placement Program. I think I have that name right, which Roni Draper mentioned, was this quote adoption program where Native children were kind of forced out of their families and sent to live with these LDS families. And we kind of want to look at obviously the trauma that had too. It wasn't a boarding school, but it was a similar program where children were removed from their families and forced to assimilate.
Yeah, and that program ended in the year 2000. So again, not ancient history. We are getting some questions here, so I'll pass this one to the panel. What can white Utahns do to support the tribes and the reporters in this story and work? That's a question I have, so I'm curious to know what the answers are.
Well, I just want to say, like, I think, going off of what Alastair was talking about, you know, there's always the possibility. I mean, we can look at the boarding school era, and we can from our vantage point now say, you know, wow, that was like a really terrible deal in terms of you know, that's colonization. Like we can name it, we can say like that's like a bad outcome of colonization. The deal is, though, we don't want to come into a story like this and then perpetuate a colonization, right? We don't want to then come in and put more hurt on a pain. And you know, it sounds like Courtney and Alastair were being very purposeful in terms of trying to figure out, you know, how do we center the voices of Indigenous peoples and put those stories forward. And of course, understanding that the Indigenous peoples who've been involved in these events, and the Paiute people in particular, are going to be very hesitant to talk with white reporters, or even a Native reporter who works for a newspaper that's run and operated primarily by white folks, and because that has a potential to do more colonizing harm than good. And so I think that white Utahns need to recognize that and put down defenses when it comes to hearing these stories and grappling with these stories, and to come to these stories with curiosity and with the willingness to put the perspectives of Indigenous peoples first, which hasn't been, you know, the history of how we've gone about understanding these kinds of events. But that's how we have to begin doing that, for sure.
Yeah. I think this question would probably best fit for Professor Ned. This is from Jennifer. I know Utah has been working on building trauma-informed state agencies in areas where there are large American Indian communities. Do those agencies need to have additional or different training on what trauma-informed means for those cultures? How might they get that training?
Ooh, good question. So trauma-informed, I'm just coming up here, trauma-informed care means this understanding of the layers in which we experience our lives. And when we talk about trauma-informed care or trauma-informed state agencies, it's because people who are in need of social services, mental health services, will go to these state agencies. And oftentimes it's not just what's on the surface that bring us into care or bring us into an urgent or critical need for care. It's these layers upon layers. And so this trauma-informed agency, would tribes need to have different or additional training? In my opinion, no. They need to have the training, but some of the best trauma-informed research is coming from Indian country. You know, I shouldn't be surprised, but I was, that even in the Choctaw language, there are words for loss of soul or spirit, which in today is really reflective of post-traumatic stress disorder, that inability to feel emotion, that inability to have executive functioning, right? That loss of control over emotion and thoughts and ability to live your best life possible. So tribal communities, they know. They just have to be asked and brought to the table on these conversations, or to lead the conversations. in terms of trauma informed, like how might people get training? Well, I would hope and know within our social work curriculum and education here across the state, not only here at the University of Utah, but also with our colleagues at UVU and up at Weber State and Utah State, at Salt Lake Community College. These ideas about trauma informed are getting into the classrooms, because there's two ways to look at this. You know, there's types of trauma, and then there are characteristics of trauma. And it's peeling away those layers in order to help someone, again, live their best life possible. So for Native communities, I think they're doing it, honestly.
Also, could you speak to the LDS Church in regards to the boarding school system specifically? I know we talked about their adoption program, but what do we know about the LDS Church and the boarding school system?
Oh yeah, I put this in the chat. What I know from, and I'll share this website with everyone towards the end of our discussion. But for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, they have documented in the United States over 367 boarding schools that have existed. 73 still remain open today in the US. And of those 73, 15 still board Native students. Okay, so have that in that context. Because education is good, it's just how do we force people in that education was bad, right? But from that understanding of 367 schools, only 14 denominations have been specifically tied to running those schools, and the LDS Church was never attached to the management, if you will, or the running of a boarding school.
This is a comment from one of our listeners. Listening today is an emotional experience. Please just speak as much as you are willing. You are bringing important stories. Thank you for being here with us. Courtney, when you look at specific articles which might come next, what are you thinking as a reporter?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've kind of touched on, putting the right perspectives out there. But I think one of the big things that we want to undertake is really mapping out where the schools were. So the Panguitch school, again, was lesser known. There were two on the Ute tribal land. But we want to kind of map where they were, see how many students that they had, how many years they were in operation, and then kind of try to collect stories from there. I think showing people really the breadth of where these schools were. I mean, this exists in Utah. I think that's kind of the big takeaway is it's easy to close your eyes and think that, oh, this happened in Canada, or oh, this happened in Pennsylvania with the Carlisle school, but no, this happened in Utah. And I think we want to map out exactly where it happened and tell more of these stories. I mean, the Utah Dena put out this letter about their own experiences with the tribal schools, having to cut their hair, having to wear different clothes, being hit if they spoke their native language. I mean, those are the stories that need to be out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say both you and Alastair, if anyone has any information on any of these schools or any tips, they should just email you. This is a question for Professor Draper. Is Indigenous education today still problematic? Obviously, we're looking at a time of tremendous abuses. Have things changed?
Well, I think that when, what Professor Ned was talking about in terms of, how to deal with the Indian problem, which is how folks talked about the issue. I'm quoting, I'm not, of course, that's not how I feel about the situation, right? Part of how we see the progression of things, from boarding schools to forced adoption and removal of children from families was was part of how we were going to take the Indianness out of young people. I mean, sort of what the federal government and what state governments understood was, yeah, we're probably not going to get that. We're not going to get the Indian out of the older generation. Like, we got to give up on them. But what we can do is we can get it out of the children. We can do this sort of cultural side, genocide, and we can get it out of the children. And so first we can pull the children away from their families where they're being educated and put them in these boarding schools. Well, that doesn't work. There's all these other kind of problems. It's kind of even expensive. It puts all this money. It puts on the expense on the governments to do this. It's really much less expensive if we take the children and put them in homes of white people. Then the white families can take on the expense all themselves of raising the children, feeding them, boarding them, and educating them. Like, the federal government doesn't even have to pay for the bills. That had its own problems as well. And as anybody who's done any kind of looking into that will see. But then what we have now, what we're dealing with now, and we're not necessarily talking about it, is, what we can do? We can simply send Indigenous kids to just public schools and not teach them anything about being Indigenous. We can just teach them how to be white. We can just teach them white stuff. We can teach them about Lewis and Clark. We can teach them about the founding fathers. We can teach them about, how to speak English, we can, never even offer their language to them, even as a foreign language, or even offer anything about their culture. That's genius. We won't make Native knowledge and Native ways of being part of the state curriculum. We won't. That's even cheaper. And so we are still participating in this project of cultural side in terms of the way that we're educating children right now. And we are finding bills propping up across the United States, banning CRT, which isn't really a thing, where we're saying, oh, you know what, we don't even want you to talk about race or talk about Indigenous histories in the school, because we think it might hurt white children's feelings. We don't care that might actually help Indigenous kids or Black kids or Latino kids or Pacific Island kids feel better about themselves and have a sense of their own cultural understanding and be able to thrive as who they are, because we're not really interested in that. We want to educate that out of children and really prop up whiteness in our schools. And as white Utahns, I just want to say, like, we're just like all going along with it. And we could stop that. We could stop that in its tracks, but we're not. And so we continue to perpetuate colonization in our schools. We perpetuate this kind of cultural side and genocide of our Native children because we are not willing to support them in having an education that will allow them to realize their full nativeness by participating in our public schools. And so that's on us. We're doing that right now. We don't have to look at the past. We're doing that today.
Thank you. Grant, can I add a little bit about what Roni added just now? Because like what she is saying is like our community is already having these conversations. And like for me and my family immediately, like we're having conversations of like, is it really worth it to go to higher education? Is it really worth it to like sacrifice your body to get a doctorate? Like, are you really like serious? And so like we have those decolonization talks in my family. Like, no, you don't necessarily need to be in higher ed to be deemed successful. And like there's other ways to be a human being, and that includes being rooted in who you are as a Native person. And that includes, at least for me, like learning our ceremonies, like learning the language, like learning how to grow food again. And I feel like with the COVID-19 pandemic, that's what Native communities are faced with. Like higher education is not all that, but it's also a tool. And then it's also important to disclaim, and I did this before, like I made higher education my identity. And I think that's where we would need to also, as Native people, to not make that your identity. And so I'm making that shift in my being. Like, yeah, I pursued higher education. Yes, I went to Gonzaga, another Catholic school, but I went to NYU. Like those are important things, but like they're not who I am. And it's just a tool in the box of who Alastair is, for instance. And so those kind of conversations are happening in our communities. And we're like, well, is higher education with these boarding schools up and center like really worth like pursuing this? And then like Dena said, education is good, but like how do you navigate that? Like how do you navigate like this in a healthy way?
Alastair, I think I felt really fortunate to have you on this story because you brought just this depth of knowledge and this huge sensitivity to the story. And the thing you kept saying to me throughout was, we need to be patient. These people are mourning. Wondering if you can talk about that.
Yeah, I was in Panguitch last week. So I did understand we got a hold of information that the Shivwits band and the Kaibab band were organizing to tour the place. And so that was in part why I went to Panguitch. And then just driving through that area, I just kind of realized like, well, no wonder Paiute people are terminated under the federal policy. Their land's beautiful. I was in Zion and I was like, this is Paiute land. That was like just that, like, or Bryce, like, and I was like, I was just trying to like understand where they were coming from. And then they banned media from what was supposed to possibly be our follow-up story. And then I understood there, and that's where I had to navigate like the tribal interests, but also the journalistic. Like I was threading that fine line of like, how do we go about this, and like what conversations need to happen. And that's when I told the team, like, we can't report on this because they didn't want me there, and understood because it was like an unofficial mourning process that they never knew. And so that, I guess we're helping in some ways, but it's up to the Paiute people themselves. But I think we're helping them connect some of the history that is not there. And so they have to find out themselves. And Dena and Roni can also probably support this claim, is that we have to listen and go their pace. I mean, we can't just be in Native communities. I've learned that like you just don't go up to them and put a recorder in their proximity of their space. Like they have to process what is happening, and that's what's happening now. And I know there is pressure as a journalist to like get the next story out like before the other outlet gets it. And so like that's kind of what I struggle with this story, is like, okay, how do we make sure the Paiute voices are front and centered? And this was not breaking news. Like I told the team already, is like, this is breaking news to us since like we were like established, or like when we had contact with Europeans or whatever. And so it's sadly breaking news in 2020 to the rest of the world. And so that's kind of like what I have to navigate that somehow. And sometimes I don't communicate it as best as I can. And so like, that's kind of where I understood the Paiute perspective, where they have to take their time, and I'm letting them. I can't do anything. I mean, they can respond to us or not. Like we may not get that response we want from them for the journalistic record, because it's on them to decide.
And I see Professor Ned is putting some links for people to learn more information. Thank you for that. We're coming up at the end of our time. I guess I'll just ask one more question to the panel. Comparing Utah to Canada, which is going through its own reckoning on its history with Indigenous people, where is Utah? What do we need to do to have a reckoning with our history in this area? And I guess we could start with Professor Draper.
I think that what is maybe difficult for folks in Utah, especially for folks who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, to reckon with, is that they maybe just don't want to know that the history of the church that they love and the history of the native peoples of the state is fraught. And that's a hard thing to know. And there is a desire to maybe go into the study of that history in a way that protects, their love of their faith community. And that's understandable. But I think that you can be honestly looking at the history and have, be diligent about that and understand that it's gonna, the people that you admire from the past aren't going to always come out looking good, and that's okay. That is okay to know also, and that it is okay for us to know that, and that when we're willing to know that, then we're also willing to heal ourselves, that we are able to move forward in a good way, and that is important work to do. And we've got to be willing to do it. We've got to be willing to look honestly at our past. And I don't know. I wish that we weren't afraid to know who we are as a people.
Courtney, I know you've done some reporting on this, communities that are wrestling with this. What is your take on where Utah is?
It's interesting. There are times when I think that Utah's caught up and we can have these conversations, and then we find a textbook that says that African-American slaves were treated kindly. It's just, I guess I don't think we're there yet, but I think it's a conversation that we need to start having and start confronting the truth. And I guess I hope that that's what we all can do is put the information out there and have honest conversations about the reality and the truth of the history.
And Professor Ned, and then we'll give Alastair the final word.
Where is Utah? That is it's a poignant and a difficult question to answer, honestly, by me, because as someone who I feel is active in my in the urban Indian community or the tribal communities that allow me to be part of their lives and their fights, right? Of their movements to educate, like in opportunities like this. I see them doing this work. So from a tribal perspective, the state of Utah is its own entity. I do see some inroads in terms of at a state level of our governor meeting with tribal leadership, right? And understanding and developing those relationships of based on self-determination, based on sovereignty, and understanding what that means from tribal government perspectives, right? And so I see Utah still need to have that education, and that these issues, these needs, these histories, need to be part. What's that saying? Part and parcel of every conversation, right? Except when these types of stories or happen, because then it's sort of that reminder of, oh yeah, this is part of our community. You know, there are native peoples of Utah. And because the only other times you really ever hear about us is if we have powwow, right?
Yeah.
Or when reporters come out to get the opinion of Native community members about July 24th.
Right.
So I think falling in line with what Courtney and Professor Draper both said, it's having this part of a conversation, having it part of education, having it part of public record, public domain. That's what needs to happen, because for Utah, there's this acknowledgement, but it's just, it hasn't blanketed the state.
Alastair, like I said, we'll give you the final word.
My perspective is Utah needs a lot of work, just like across the board. I previously worked in Salt Lake in Utah, and just the experience of it like really burnt me out. And then I had to leave it. I had to like really heal myself. I'm like, did I just go through this experience of like all this beating in Utah? As far as like when it comes to conversations around Indigenous experiences, and I felt like I had to come back to the Navajo Nation for a little bit to really ground myself and really understand like that's Utah. that's kind of like and I've said this in previous different panels and different roles that I've held. And I said, I think Utah needs lots of work. And I think that's why and then now that I'm with the Salt Lake Tribune as a Southern Utah reporter, I was driving through the area like last week and I realized like this is lots of like formerly Trump territory. And so like I was just trying to like understand that, but I also saw it as an opportunity, as indicated in this panel. Like it's an opportunity to really like correct the narratives that exist around Indigenous communities. And so I feel like I'm now ready to go and help Utah in some ways transform, because I know Native leaders like Dena and others they've asked me like, why are you moving? And I'm like, I'm burnt out from this state. Like I need to get away. and so like, they're like, you're needed here. We want you here. And so like, I guess I just needed to be reborn again and I'm reborn now as a reporter to like actually help change the narrative, hopefully with some of the journalism that I would add to the team, but also with this story on Panguitch.
Well, we're really excited to have you on board at the Tribune, Alastair. Alastair and Courtney, thank you both so much for joining us. And then Professor Ned and Professor Draper, thank you so much for your time and your insight and for talking through this very emotionally charged issue. The Tribune's going to stay on top of it and we'll keep reporting on it. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you. I'll go on that. See ya.
Wow. Thank you.